Welcome back, everybody. You got Will and I-Man here from the Block Runner, and today we're going to talk about Mark Zuckerberg's latest talk on the Metaverse. So what do you think, I-Man?
Pretty intense, dude. It's like a few months ago, we were like all up in arms whenever Libra was coming out, right? Everyone's like, no, dude, how dare you try and enter our space with your centralized freaking like overlord mentality, right? Like, I think the whole Libra thing that scared everyone was Facebook was constructing this whole like big tech like oligarchy, right? I think it was like 20 different big tech firms or companies creating this like basically validator network, right, for their own stable currency or something like that.
Which some of them dropped off.
Yeah, because they're getting like huge regulatory scrutiny, you know, like that he had to get summoned by by Congress, and it was a whole ordeal, right? And it was a good example of like the difference between a centralized and a decentralized, I guess, organization, right? You know, you can't summon MakerDAO community. It's like, hey, come explain yourselves. How you guys you're making what now? This stable currency called DAI?
Yeah.
It's like, what do we do about it as the government? You can't really summon people, right?
That's right. I guess the point of this video is Mark Zuckerberg is saying a lot of the things that we've been saying for like 2 years now, and which is cool, right? So he's thinking about it the way that we think about it. The metaverse is like the internet. It's not, you don't create metaverses because you're not creating internets. What you're doing is you're creating an umbrella term of a concept, an idea of a digital presence, and that digital presence can traverse to the different metaverses, right? But he's saying a lot of the good things, but it's not necessarily that you know, this is generally like a great thing, because like you said, we were talking about how Libra was going to come in, and they were saying that they're going to provide, you know, financial resources to the disenfranchised, which is great. But the way they were doing it, it looked so scummy, so slimy. And
yeah, it's just and also they have like their reputation of
hacked,
I guess. Yeah, just mismanagement of like such precious resources, which is like user data.
Yes.
So the last thing we want is like, you know, users' finances to be like under the control of this same umbrella.
That's right.
You know what I mean? If they did such a terrible job of like maintaining the integrity of our identity and our online presence, all this stuff, and then they just so easily like handed it over, I guess, to entities that were looking for ways to exploit this data. I think was like the main argument. Yeah, like what are they going to do once they get their hands on everybody's like financial feature? Like oof, big oof. Yeah. Right? How is this any better than banking cartels?
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. If they were able to execute on that, they would be the biggest company by far, and it's not even close.
Yeah. So I think like government understood that really quickly, and they're like, we can't let this happen.
Yeah, they cracked down fast. Like as soon as they made the announcement, he was like in Congress like a month later.
It's so true. Yeah. It was actually kind of wild. But that was like the first time like where something was like so evidently like against the grain, and like we just can't let this happen.
Yeah.
So here we are, what, like a year later or so?
Still waiting for Libra, right? Which I called it, dude. This wasn't happening, and it hasn't happened. Now, of course, they can like come up with something different, and you know, it could release. But
I think Mark has to. I think he is like all these big tech guys. They're gonna have to come to the realization like this movement. It's against the big tech oligarchs, right? It's all about the community. It's all about user owned things. So if he really wants to make like a presence in this space, like he's going to have to eventually gravitate towards like our side, right? Like decentralization is what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. For specifically Libra is what you're talking about, right?
Well, and this metaverse example too. I mean, he doesn't have to. Clearly, like the metaverse idea is it's all encompassing. It includes things like Fortnite and Minecraft and Roblox, which are hugely successful platforms, but I don't think they fit that true narrative of what like the real metaverse heads have in mind, as far as like, you know, a true like open source user governed economy. You know what I mean? Like these things are not really achievable in the traditional space.
Yeah, and the closest thing that we have to what you're talking about is Decentraland.
Exactly. That's why we're here. Like I think Decentraland is the closest thing to like that real narrative of what the metaverse eventually is going to end up becoming, you know. But that's not to say Facebook shouldn't be doing what they're doing, right? Like they should like release their interpretation, right? Like that's good.
Yes.
And I think that's good for the space.
Yeah, and he was talking about the same things we talk about, interoperability, and which is like one of the most complicated things to do in terms of like the digital space, because yeah, you can have an ERC 721 NFT, but just because that potentially might be a 3D model in Decentraland, you can't just port that into Horizons, which is what Facebook is building, right, at their own metaverse. And so that interoperability, he was talking about how there might be a regulatory or kind of like a standardization body, like within the metaverse, and creating these standards, like an ERC 721 is a standard. And that's how you could cultivate like the interoperability aspect of the metaverse. So we agree with that. I think there has to be some sort of like standard for these things, but it comes with limitations, right? So you won't have like, say you're comparing the game engines of Unity versus like Unreal Engine 5. Unreal Engine 5 looks like real life, right? It's that crazy. And Unity potentially doesn't, right? And so you can't create real life assets and then just port it over to Unity. It doesn't really work that way. So
yeah, well, why would you want to do that in the first place?
Well, because you're expecting interoperability, that's why.
Yeah, so that's another thing. It's not just like the decentralized economic component to make a true metaverse. It's also, yeah, from what I've heard from multiple sources, like big thought leaders in the metaverse space, interoperability, like true interoperability, it's an expectation. Like
it is.
It has to exist. It doesn't exist currently because like all these things you're saying, it's very difficult to do with all these isolated different verses within the metaverse. Like, yes. Yeah, there are no standards, so communication between platforms is not necessarily.
Yeah, and I even posed you the questions like, do things really need to be interoperable, or does your avatar, your identity, your history on the blockchain, maybe that's the only thing that needs to be interoperable?
Your ID. You call it a soul, which I like.
Yeah, it's
your digital soul. You know, we all have our own physical soul that literally, like, it is us. It's our existence, our presence, whatever. It's our presence in space and time.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
for sure.
So in the digital realm, that's largely lacking, and it always has, even through the internet era, right? I was talking about how it would have been a good idea, like in the early days of the internet, to somebody to standardize like your online presence, so that like you're well, that's the thing. It's not easy to achieve without blockchain, right? You can't necessarily log everybody's like historical, lifetime of usage of the internet,
right?
Because each different internet website or protocol, whatever you want to call them, platform, they're isolated, right?
Yeah,
like
that's right.
Every time you join a new website, you got to create a new profile.
Yes.
So,
but there's going to be a generation. There's going to be a generation that's like born, and like every interaction with a website or a metaverse is going to be logged on the blockchain. And eventually that's going to happen. There's projects kind of working on that, like Civic, and there's like identity projects out there, but they haven't really penetrated it in terms of like actual use cases yet, for whatever reason. Maybe it requires like government adoption or something and really to take hold, but like the idea of a soul traversing the different metaverses, and that soul represents your history and it's logged everything on the blockchain, like that sounds like what people are expecting. Not the fact that you bought, an NFT and you want to showcase that in these different metaverses. Like that's way more complicated. And maybe so complicated.
Way more complicated, but I think I still think it's an expectation down the line.
So? You think so? Interesting.
I think so, dude.
It's gonna be hard. It's doable. It's doable. Like you could create a platform. Like let's take MetaZone for example, where you have 10 different metaverses, right? Decentraland and 9 others, and you say, okay, you're gonna create an NFT and you're gonna submit it to MetaZone. If you want your NFT to be deployable in these 10 different metaverses, well, you're gonna have to build 10 different 3D models that can be deployed in all 10 different metaverses, right? They have different limitations, different demands, different everything, resolutions and everything. So you might have to build 10 different ones. And then now your single NFT can now be deployed in 10 different metaverses.
Yeah, the problem is that's not scalable, right? Because expand that number 10 to like 1 million. Like imagine
there's a million metaverses.
Yeah, it's just like it's as infinite as the web. Right?
Actually, it is possible to do like 1 million metaverses as long as those 1 million metaverses are following a metaverse standard. Then you could do it.
Yeah, the way I have it in my mind, like what I think the vision of interoperability is going to look like is there has to be like an overall database for, and a platform like MetaZone is a good step one to this, where the content within the metaverse ecosystem like gets submitted to this database. Let's call it Google. Mm-hmm. Google is the internet's database essentially. So every unit of content comes with it, like it's rendering files, whatever. It gets stored in a singular location.
Yeah.
So there has to be some kind of engine developed. So like anytime you enter a new space in the metaverse, you're querying this engine to retrieve this new space that I've entered into with my soul.
Yeah.
To instantly re-render all the assets that I already have, right? And the reason why it's doable is because the assets are all, they're in the database. Yeah. I have ownership of those specific assets.
Yeah, that's possible too.
It is possible, right? But it's obviously incredibly complicated. But we're talking about like, it's basically a Google like engine without like direct querying. It's more like based on action. Like the action is I've entered Somnium space with my soul. Because Somnium space is using this engine, your user profile instantly, maybe there's probably like a small load time, right? Because you have to render all these assets into this new space. I'm thinking that could happen.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it could happen, but man, that's an endeavor like no other to do something like that.
Hell yeah, dude. So where's our Sergey Brin and what's the other guy's name?
Sergey and was it Larry?
Larry Page, I think.
Larry Page, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, we need those guys to build this engine of the future, right? In order for the metaverse to be truly interoperable. So like you as a creator, you don't have to go to each space and like recreate these models one by one. It's just these spaces have to load up this database with like these parameters, I guess, so that whenever these assets do enter or these characters enter your space, generation happens.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. Some of the content in Decentraland can be generated with straight code and without having to deal with like a .glb file or .gltf file. And that code could run pretty much on any engine, right? That code generates your 3D model, right? We're running that right now on our MetaZone tower, right? That tower isn't a GLB. It's basically just code. And so now extrapolate that into something more complicated, then you could just regenerate everything into all these different metaverses because all they're doing is just running code, right? The limitation is in the GLB itself. It's in the 3D model itself because that 3D model has to be either low poly for Decentraland or a low poly thing doesn't make sense in an Unreal Engine 5 environment, right? So that's the problem.
Sandbox. Yeah.
Or sandbox, yeah.
Yeah. So these are like the standards and frameworks we're talking about. Like there's a lot of infrastructure I think that needs to be built to see like a real version of like an interoperable metaverse where like your assets truly are traversable, like from one location to the next. Because in this interview, there's an actual audio interview on this article, which we should have in the description. It's towards the bottom. Like Zuckerberg talks about his vision, like Facebook's vision of an interoperable metaverse where you can literally teleport from one verse to another. And again, like you're saying that your soul, your presence, your being follows you into that other universe. You know what I mean? So clearly Facebook hasn't figured out how to do it yet either. But they're in the same boat as us, dude. Like we're in like the early experimentation phase of the metaverse, but it's so early. We're still trying to figure out the definition of the damn thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So now let's talk about the speculative aspect of why we're talking about this, because we're going to make a prediction here. There's going to be tons of metaverses coming out. There's going to be tons of, all of a sudden, these land sales, because the land sales need to happen in order to pay for the whole project. There's going to be a ton of land sale rug pulls. These projects sell out their land and all of a sudden disappear, right? We're going to see that. That will happen. And then there's going to be this metaverses who have projects and they try to execute and they fail. So we're going to see the whole gambit of what we've seen in crypto, what we're seeing in the NFT space. And so all this is going to happen. So, but the point here is that Mark Zuckerberg, people tend to listen to this guy, and they tend to hear what he has to say, and his thoughts are relatively aligned with our thoughts of the metaverse. So from a speculation standpoint, then you're kind of looking at, well, what metaverses exist? We got Decentraland, Sandbox, Omnium Space, CryptoVoxels, right? Those are the player-owned spaces. There are a ton of metaverses out there like Fortnite and Roblox and Minecraft that are not player-owned. So, I think we're going to see an explosion of different player-owned metaverses tied to the blockchain, and we're going to see, tons, thousands and millions of players jumping into this space because everyone's talking about it now. So yeah, I mean, that's the reason why we're talking about this, is because now, just like Elon Musk said Bitcoin was cool, and all of a sudden it skyrockets to $65,000, now we're going to have big names talking about the metaverse.
Yeah, it's definitely like the big tech influencers are starting to really drive the overall market sentiment for sure. Because, I mean, as they kind of, I don't know if they should or not, but I mean, they hold that kind of power and esteem from, previous accomplishments. Elon Musk is taking us to a whole new planet.
Yeah.
Jack Dorsey, that's his name, right? Jack Dorsey,
Twitter
founder.
Twitter, yeah.
He was also shilling Bitcoin. I mean, he's created a massive platform. He's wildly successful. These are big tech, titans within the space. So now it seems like, I don't know, like we've hit that point where now the tech space is starting to really try and find their entry point into like, establishing some type of presence within our sector, the centralized ecosystem. So yeah, just Mark Zuckerberg's just another example of that. And we already know the historical precedent of like that influence pushing these narratives, like what that does to the market sentiment. And it's huge. It's very positive usually.
It's so huge. And let me read a quote from Mark himself. He says, "I think this," which he's talking about the metaverse, "is going to be a really big part of the next chapter for the technology industry. And it's something that we're very excited about." So he's talking about the metaverse being more of like the same internet that we're used to in our little, rectangles that he calls it, but it's more about the internet that's a little bit more recognizable, a little bit more familiar, a little bit more approachable, rather than like these rectangles. These rectangles, they allow us to communicate, but it's not natural for humans to communicate via these rectangles. So the metaverse takes us a more like a persistent presence where we can interact a little bit more naturally. And so that's his point. And I think he's relatively right. I think generally the metaverse is going to be a big thing. And I think we're going to see not only just like game platforms take advantage of the metaverse space. I think we're going to see all kinds of like, Nike, these huge brands like jumping into this metaverse idea.
I agree. 100%. And of course, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg being in a very unique position to
have his own platform,
have such interest. Yeah, I mean, they're strong, like heavily invested into the VR space, the Oculus platform.
Yeah,
I mean, the Oculus is doing pretty well. I think like it's improving, little by little, but people are starting to be more and more interested in this whole VR arena, and like the game developers within that space are getting better and better at creating cool games and experiences. So yeah, this is like the next big step for this space. I think it's figuring out how to create these actual, like you're saying, these persistent open world type experiences that live on forever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where you can actually come into them and potentially make a living and actually prioritize your living in these spaces, right? Because it's to your advantage to do that. That's part of our goal too, in the whole metaverse sector. Like in our mind, the metaverse is the perfect playground for play to earn economics, just economics of all kind. Play to earn just seems to be like the most obvious.
Yeah, I mean, look at what Axie's done. In the last 30 days, they processed $500 million in volume. And so this is, I think this is the first blockchain game to like reach that like sphere of like volume. And they're only dealing with maybe a couple 100,000 players, right? There's billions of players out in the world, right? Just imagine, just imagine once those billion players recognize that blockchain exists and there's ownable assets. I mean, you're going to see Axie like, in the multi-billion-dollar kind of like sphere, I guess, and start competing with Roblox, which is worth $45 billion. But yeah, that's the conversation for today. Hopefully, you guys learned something new about the metaverse and what Mark Zuckerberg was talking about. If you disagree with Mark, let us know in the comment section below, and like, subscribe, and we will catch you in the next video.
All right, later.